Welcome, champions, to the next in my series of diving even deeper into a single champion and explaining what a formation designed for them looks like, and going into detail about why it works. So let's get right into talking about Asharra, the lawful neutral Aarakocra wizard. One of the biggest highlights about Asharra, who I personally believe to be the 5th best raw damage dealer in the game, is the fact that she is a core champion that everyone starts out with. Though, that being the case, she is very reliant on what champions you have unlocked to be able to get her true damage rolling. There are many options for that though. Everything comes down to her bonds, which are her 2 separate specialization choices. Before going into that depth, I want to quickly go over the fact that her primary attack is a multi-hitting attack, which is useful, and her ultimate is a good tool, pushing enemies back and then launching an AoE fireball. So, these spec choices come down to brackets of races that she will increase the damage of by a flat, decent amount. What makes Asharra herself a DPS is her ability Paragon of Curse Abal, which increases the potency of the bonds, and makes it to where if there are 4 slotted of one of her bonds in your formation, she will also receive that damage increase. And she can do so for each bond choice, double dipping into that sweet damage buff. But as you can imagine, requiring 4 of each bond, 8 total slotted champions of a potential 9 to 10 within your formation makes her incredibly restrictive. Her first bond choice is between either humans, dwarves and elves together, or Potpourri, which is Aarakocra, Dragonborn, Furbolg, Lizard Folk, Minotaur, Tiefling and Turtle, all rolled into one. The second is between half and half, a combo of halflings, half-elf, and half-orc. Short folk, a cluster of shorties between gnomes, goblins, which we need more of, halflings, kobolds, the nerds, and plasmoid. And lastly, exotic, which is the leftovers of everything else, like Aasimar, Bullywug, Doppelganger, Genasi, Gith, Harengun, Kalishtar, Sariel, Tabaxi, Warforged, Modron, and Yuan Ti. Sheesh. So looking at your unlocked roster of the game, you have to think of what your best buffers are, and who you can pair them with to fit within the confines of her bonds. That being said, Potpourri is the most common pick for her first bond choice, and half is the most common second pick. However, exotic is also viable, and in my opinion better. Potpourri will always be the most valid first pick because Asharra herself counts for it as an Aarakocra, and she'll always be slotted in her own formation, so you have in a way an extra flex slot by doing that. So who else do we have to work with to slot in your formation to reach 4 for Potpourri, 4/4? That is also a decent buffer. In Seat 1, Orkira is the clear winner, as she is easy to slot and reaches great debuffing heights once you have her healing flame stacked up. Refer to my Seat 1 video if you need a refresher on that. Seat 2 has Donner and Korth, both who are overall pretty average, but still decent choices. Talon is not a consideration since his antagonist cannot affect neutral champions, which Asharra is. Seat 3 has Mehen and Gromma, which I think Gromma edges Mehen out. Gromma covers more utility ground by debuffing and tanking. And while Gromma isn't the best tank per se, Asharra is neutral, so she can at least benefit from Shades of Grey if you choose to tank with Gromma. And Asharra's last formation ability, Take Flight, has to stack up over time while the formation is under attack, so it does synergize well with Gromma's Spiked Shell if doing so. Otherwise, just go with the Arctic Circle. Seat 4 has Kent, who is actually a great support and solid choice. Seat 5 has Quillick, who isn't bad, but Seat 5 also has Briv and Valentine, who are very hard to compete with for different reasons, which I'll explain in a second, though I'm sure many of you know where that's going to lead. Seat 7 has Egbert, who offers a little bit of everything, some crowd control, tanking, healing, gold find, but will not necessarily be the best buffing option. Seat 9 has Makos and Shaka, both solid options who are about equal with each other. But as Makos is a core champion, he'll often be your pick. Seat 10 has Tyrell and Havilar, but will always be outperformed by Ulcoria, and Virgil, but we'll get to that. so you're better off filling up your bonds elsewhere and leaving this seat open. But Tyrell is a great tank, but won't increase your damage all that well, with Asharra being neutral and him buffing good. And Havilar isn't bad at all, but again, she just gets outperformed. Torogar is also here, but he only buffs evil champions. Seat 11 has Strix, but she competes with two of the best buffers in the entire game in that seat, Averin and Nova. Who you take between those two will depend on your second bond choice. So let's take a look at that now, since Arkan in seat 12 should not be considered as he is not a support. As I said, the most common second pick is half and half, so taking Averin from seat 11 is a no-brainer. But Exotic has opened up as an excellent choice as well, with the Nova plus Valentine synergy, since Nova is exotic. For those who don't know, we pair Valentine with Nova because if you take Nova's first specialization, she gives her formation ability, the Crew, to those 2 slots away and 3 slots away. But they are technically different instances of the same buff. So if Valentine is in a different distanced version of the buff, she will give it to your DPS with her formation ability, effectively giving you the Crew twice. So for instance here, Asharra is 3 slots away and Valentine is 2 slots away. In doing so, Asharra is receiving 2 instances of the Crew. This is very powerful, and one of the only things that can contend with and even exceed Averin's raw buffing potential. So let's cover them both and see what half and half versus exotic looks like. Let's start with saying you're rocking Averin for half and half. That means we need 3 more candidates. You have Regis and Krydle in seat 2. With Krydle's rework, he is now a very good option. Seat 3 has Omen, who is a pretty decent choice. Seat 9 has Jaheira, who was also buffed with Season 2 a little bit and is a decent choice. Seat 5 has a few choices between Calliope, Briv, and Valentine. Calliope is great for beginners to fill up half and half as a core champion. Briv is one of the best tanks, healers, and speed champions in the entire game. And when invested in, Valentine is an amazing buffer. Some really great options here. Seat 6 is where Asharra rests her cloaca, so we can't use Shandy here. Seat 7 has Freely, who is an amazing debuffer, but since Asharra's choices come so limited, it's really hard to get a roster full of the same chaotic, neutral, lawful alignment for his specialization. Still, very good though. Rosie in seat 10 isn't considered since she's a DPS, and you're going to be using Ulcoria anyway. Clearly we're using Averin in seat 11, and seat 12 now has 2 really solid options between Penelope and Daub. So with all of that considered, a potpourri / half and half formation will look something like this. In a multi-tank situation, we have a few options. It all works together quite well. With this formation, we have 5 potpourri, so we have a little wiggle room. You can use that wiggle room to replace one of the potpourri with another decent buffer, like Hitch in seat 8, or Baloth in seat 4, and seat 9 is also a good flexible position because we can swap Ayla, an excellent tank and debuffer, for Makos / Shaka or Jaheira if needed. When you need a third tank, you can place Grama over another potpourri or swap Freely to Egbert and get another half and half elsewhere. Now then, what about exotic over half and half? There are a few reasons you'd want to do this. First and primarily, Nova plus Valentine is insanely strong, and Nova counts as exotic. And when we start thinking about who else is exotic, there are a few other really potent options. Seat 1 has Turiel and Cisaspia, Turiel being the winner in my opinion, and is decent but maybe not the best pick. Seat 2 has Blushi, a very strong buffer, one of the best under the right circumstances, and offers you another tank. Nahara in seat 3 isn't considered since she's a DPS, and Sentry in seat 4 is another solid pick, tank and speed, though her buffing will probably be outmatched. Then we have Xeraphon in seat 7, which is surface level average, but if you spend the right amount of time, some great buffing output. Seat 8 has Nrak and Tatiana. Tatiana usually being the better pick here, as another tank and decent buffer, but do note Asharra does have enough wisdom to be buffed by Nrak to make her bonds even girthier. He can work in a pinch, but as always he rarely adds enough to stack up against a legitimate buffer. Seat 9 has Birdsong and Nordom, Birdsong in my opinion being the winner between the two. Seat 10 has Yorvin, very average, but also has Virgil, who if you haven't watched my video on yet, check that out, because he is very strong, able to contend with and potentially exceed Ulcoria. but it requires farming him up each run. And Seed 11 again has Nova. So a potpourri/exotic formation will look something like this. Overall, a bit more output with the Valentine/Nova combo, and if you farm up Xeraphon, Belushi, and Virgil, then you will just start smacking. That's kind of the theme with exotic though. They will be good, being on par with half and half, without farming their respective mechanics. Belushi requiring a life well lived, Xeraphon's repeated imitation, and Virgil's weather control. But when you do farm them up, that's good soup. Her overall biggest drawback is her availability. Her formation is naturally limiting no matter which way you go. And she's only available for 2 patrons and has 2 day 1 Tiamat restrictions she's not viable for. And once restrictions start kicking in, her options for bonds start to become far more limited. At the end of the day, for a core champion, she gets some really good output, and you don't have to use any of the champions I've mentioned here. They just happen to be some powerful combinations. You could go humans and shorties and still perform well, and as I always say, play who you want to play. But with a DPS, you do want to stay within their own mechanical confines. So work with those bonds and push your walls. I'm glad you chose to spend your time here with me today. I'd love it if you'd bond with that like, sub, and bell for me. Leave a comment on what you're expecting from these Plasmoid, GIF, and Kalishtar champions. Because as far as I know, there aren't even spoilers about that. Are there? Stay tuned because I'm always working on the next one. Have a hell of a time out there, champion.